Shadows Beneath the Veil. Prologue. The candle flickered in the darkness, casting long shadows across the stone walls of the chamber. Magister Thorne's gnarled fingers trembled as he turned the ancient pages, the brittle parchment cracking beneath his touch. His eyes, milky with cataracts yet somehow still sharp with intelligence, traced the faded script. "It was never meant to be found," he whispered to the empty room. "Some knowledge is not for mortal minds." The book had come to him 3 nights prior, delivered by a hooded figure whose face he could not recall, though he had stared directly at it. All that remained in his memory was a sense of profound unease, as though he had gazed not upon flesh but something that merely wore the shape of it. Outside, beyond the leaded glass of his study window, the perpetual mists of Blackmere curled and twisted against the panes like spectral fingers seeking entry. The town had not seen true sunlight in 7 generations, not since the night the veil had first descended, the night the world changed. Thorne's finger paused over a particular passage, the ink seeming to writhe beneath his gaze. "When the 5th moon wanes and the stars align in the pattern of the elder sign, the veil shall thin, and what waits beyond shall peer through. They who bear the mark shall hear the calling, and the blood of the innocent shall be the key that turns the lock." A chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the damp cold of his chambers. The 5th moon would wane in a fortnight's time. "Too soon," he muttered, reaching for his quill. "I must warn them." The candle guttered suddenly, as though caught in a draught, though the air was still. In the brief moment of darkness, something shifted in the corner of the room, something that had not been there before. Thorne did not turn. He knew what awaited him if he did. Instead, he dipped his quill in ink and began to write furiously, his hand flying across the parchment. "To whoever finds these words, take heed. The veil thins. The marked ones gather. Seek the woman called Elara Nightshade in the withered woods. Tell her Thorne sends his final warning. It begins again." The scratching of his quill was the only sound in the room until, with a wet, sliding noise, something moved closer. "I know what you are," Thorne said, his voice steady despite his fear. "I know why you've come." The response came not in words, but in a low, undulating moan that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound of it made Thorne's teeth ache and his vision blur. With a final flourish, he signed his name and sprinkled sand across the wet ink. Only then did he turn to face what waited in the shadows. His scream lasted only seconds before it was cut short, but it echoed through the twisted streets of Blackmere long into the night, carried by the mist like a harbinger of the horrors to come. By morning, Magister Thorne was gone, leaving behind only a pool of viscous black liquid on the floor and the sealed letter on his desk. The book, however, had vanished. And so it began. Chapter 1. The Marked. Elara Nightshade knew she was being followed the moment she set foot in Ravenscroft. The city hadn't changed in the decades since she'd fled. The same crooked spires pierced the perpetually grey sky. The same gargoyles leered from their perches atop the cathedral of the Forgotten Saint, and the same sickly sweet smell of rotting roses and incense hung in the air. But something was different. Something watched. She pulled her hood lower, obscuring the silver streak in her otherwise raven hair. The mark that had appeared on the night her powers had manifested, the night she had killed her first man. Not that it had been a man by then, not really. What had worn Gerard Blackwood's skin, that night, had been something altogether different. The cobblestones were slick with the evening mist as she made her way through the twisting alleys of the lower ward. Faces turned away as she passed. Even with her features hidden, the people of Ravenscroft could sense the otherness that clung to her like a shroud. The marked were never welcome, merely tolerated out of fear and necessity. "Witch," someone hissed from a shadowed doorway. "Defiler." Elara kept walking. Such words had lost their sting long ago. The thorned apple appeared before her, its weathered sign swinging gently despite the absence of wind. The painted fruit, once vibrant crimson, had faded to the color of dried blood, its thorns exaggerated to resemble talons. Appropriate, she thought, for a place where secrets were traded like currency and loyalties shifted with the phases of the 5 moons. She pushed open the door, and the low murmur of conversation within stuttered to a halt. A dozen pairs of eyes turned to her, reflecting the light of the hearth fire like those of nocturnal beasts. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her hood. The silver streak in her hair gleamed, and a collective intake of breath whispered through the room. She allowed her gaze to drift over the assembled patrons. Merchants, sailors, a pair of ordained sisters with their distinctive crimson robes, and in the far corner, a figure whose features were obscured by a porcelain mask painted with the visage of a weeping child. The masked figure lifted a gloved hand in silent greeting. Her contact. "We don't serve her kind here," the innkeeper said, his hand straying beneath the counter where, Elara knew, he kept a silver-bladed dagger, as if such mundane weapons could harm her. "You served my coin readily enough when I paid for a private room this morning," the masked figure said, voice muffled and sexless behind the porcelain. "The woman is with me." The innkeeper's eyes narrowed, but he nodded curtly and returned to polishing a tankard with a rag that seemed to merely redistribute the grime. Elara crossed the room, feeling the weight of stairs upon her back. The masked figure rose and led her up a narrow staircase to a small chamber on the second floor. Only when the door was bolted did they speak again. "You're either brave or foolish to return to Ravenscroft, Nightshade." The figure removed the mask, revealing a face that was strikingly ordinary. Neither handsome nor ugly, neither young nor old, with features so unremarkable they seemed to blur in Elara's vision when she tried to focus on them. "Perhaps both. I received a summons I could not ignore, Faceless," Elara replied, using the moniker the spy was known by in whispered circles. "Though I admit I expected Thorne himself, not his agent." The Faceless placed the mask on a table and gestured for Elara to sit. "Thorne is dead. Or worse." Elara felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "How? That's the question that brought you here." The Faceless reached into a satchel and withdrew a sealed letter, the wax bearing Thorne's distinctive sigil. A thorn-wrapped rose. His final message. "For you alone." As Elara reached for the letter, her sleeve pulled back, revealing the intricate tattoo that wound around her wrist. A pattern of interlocking circles and ancient runes that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The Faceless gaze lingered on the mark. "There are others gathering. Others like you." "Marked ones?" Elara asked, breaking the seal on the letter. "Yes, but not all bear their marks where eyes can see." The Faceless moved to the window, peering through a gap in the heavy curtains. "Something stirs beyond the veil, Nightshade. Something that has waited a very long time." Elara unfolded the parchment and read Thorne's final words, his usually meticulous script hurried and jagged. With each line, the chill within her deepened. "The 5th moon," she murmured. "When it wanes." 2 weeks from now, the Faceless confirmed. "Whatever comes, it begins then." Elara folded the letter and tucked it into a bodice, close to her heart. "Thorne mentions a book. The Codex Umbra." "Yes." The Faceless turned back from the window, face grim. "It vanished the night he died. We believe the cult of the Watching Eye has it now. Then I must retrieve it." Elara rose, her mind already racing with plans. "And I'll need to find the others. The marked ones. There is one here in Ravenscroft. A man called Damienblackwood." Elara froze. "Blackwood? As in?" "Yes. The brother of the man you killed. Or what was left of him." The Faceless donned the mask once more, becoming instantly unknowable. "He's been looking for you for a very long time, Nightshade. Nearly as long as the things beyond the veil have." Outside, the first moon began to rise, casting a pale green light through the gap in the curtains. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled, low and mournful. "The witching hour begins," the Faceless said. "Best we continue this conversation elsewhere. These walls have grown ears." As if in response, a soft scratching sound emanated from within the plaster, like the scurrying of rats, or something pretending to be rats. Elara nodded and pulled her hood up once more. "Take me to Blackwood. It's time we had a long overdue reunion." As they slipped out into the corridor, neither noticed the shadow that detached itself from the wall behind them, flowing along the floor in their wake. A shadow that moved against the light, hungry and patient. The hunt had begun. Chapter 2, Blood Ties. Damienblackwood stood at the edge of the hollow, watching as the ceremonial fires were lit one by one around the ancient stone circle. Each flame burned a different color: crimson, azure, emerald, violet, and a fifth that seemed to consume light rather than emit it, a void-like blackness that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. "The sacrifices are prepared, Master Blackwood," said a robed acolyte, head bowed low. 5, as tradition demands." Damien nodded, his expression hidden behind the half-mask of polished bone that covered the left side of his face. The side that had been ruined the night his brother died, melted and reformed into something that was neither fully human nor wholly other. His mark, his curse. "Are they willing?" he asked, though the answer mattered little. The ritual would proceed regardless. 3 came freely. 2 were persuaded. Damien sighed. "Ensure they are comfortable until the time comes. Fear sours the blood." The acolyte bowed again and retreated, leaving Damien alone at the precipice. Below, The hollow yawned like an open wound in the earth, a perfectly circular depression, nearly 100 feet deep. At its center stood the monolith, a single spire of obsidian stone covered in carvings, so ancient that no living scholar could decipher them. The stone predated not only Ravenscroft but, some whispered, humanity itself. It was from the monolith that the first veil had emerged after the calamity, spreading outward to envelop Ravenscroft, Blackmere, and a dozen other settlements in perpetual twilight. That had been 3 centuries ago. Now, the signs suggested another change was imminent. The sound of footsteps on gravel alerted him to an approach. He did not turn. "You're late, Cordelia." A woman moved to stand beside him, her white blonde hair shocking against the black of her high-collared gown. Delicate silver chains connected a series of piercings along the shell of her ear, and her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, regarded the scene below with clinical detachment. "I was detained," Cordelia Frost replied. "The cathedral is in an uproar. 2 of the ordained sisters were found dead in the reliquary this morning, their eyes removed, their tongues replaced with silver coins." Damien's grip tightened on the railing. The cult of the watching eye. So it would seem. Cordelia withdrew a small leather pouch from her sleeve and handed it to him. "I retrieved what you asked for." Inside the pouch, Damien found a vial of viscous black liquid, the same substance that had been found at the scene of Thorne's disappearance. "Is it blood?" he asked. Cordelia's lips quirked in what might have been amusement. "Not as we understand it. I've analyzed it thoroughly. It responds to stimuli. It moves when it thinks no one is watching." Damien pocketed the vial. "And the codex? Still missing." Cordelia turned her gaze to him, her expression softening fractionally. "You shouldn't have sent for her, Damien." "I didn't." He gestured to the fires below, now fully ablaze. "But the ritual requires 5 marked ones. She's the 5th. After what she did to Gerard." "What she did to what was wearing my brother's skin," Damien corrected, his voice sharp. "Gerard was gone long before she put a blade through his heart." Cordelia fell silent, studying the half of Damien's face that remained unmarred. Handsome in a severe way, with a strong jaw and eyes the colour of burnished copper. Few knew the true extent of his feelings for Elara Nightshade, but Cordelia had been his confidant too long not to recognise the conflict that raged within him. "The Faceless brought her the letter?" she asked after a moment. "Yes, they'll be here soon." Damien straightened, adjusting the fall of his black coat. "Prepare the inner chamber. We'll need privacy for what comes next." Cordelia nodded and moved away, her steps silent as she descended the winding path toward the circle of fires. Damien remained at his vantage point, watching as robed figures began to gather around the monolith, their chanting a low, dissonant hum that seemed to make the very air vibrate. 10 years he had waited for this moment. 10 years of study, of sacrifice, of slowly gathering power and allies. 10 years since the night Elara had killed what remained of his brother and fled, leaving Damien scarred and transformed. 10 years of dreams in which faceless entities whispered secrets that left him waking with bloody tears streaking his cheeks and formally scratched into his own flesh. Now, finally, the pieces were moving into place. The veil would thin, and what waited beyond would offer answers. About the marked ones, about the changes spreading through the land, about the true nature of the calamity that had altered reality itself 3 centuries ago. But first, he would face Elara again, and in that meeting, he would learn whether the feelings that still smouldered within him were love or hatred, or something far more dangerous than either. A flutter of wings drew his attention upward. A raven circled overhead, larger than any natural bird, its feathers gleaming with an oily iridescence. It cawed once, the sound unnaturally deep and resonant, before swooping down toward the city. Damien's messenger, returning with news. "She's here," he whispered to the empty air. "Find her. Bring her to me." In response, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant toll of the cathedral bells, marking the 2nd hour past midnight. The 5 moons hung in the sky like watchful eyes, their combined light casting multiple shadows behind every object. Shadows that sometimes moved independently of their owners. Below, the chanting grew louder, and the black flame at the center of the circle flared higher, reaching toward the starless sky like a grasping hand. The ritual had begun. Chapter 3. Echoes in the Dark. The sewers beneath Ravenscroft were not merely conduits for waste, but a labyrinthine network of tunnels, chambers, and forgotten catacombs that predated the city itself. They whispered with echoes, some recent, some ancient, and it was these echoes that Elara followed as she and the Faceless made their way through the darkness. "There," she said, pausing to place her palm against the slime-slicked wall. "Do you hear it?" The faceless tilted their head, the porcelain mask gleaming faintly in the light of the phosphorescent fungi that clung to the ceiling. "I hear nothing but water and rats." "Not with your ears," Elara chided, closing her eyes. "Listen with your blood." A moment of silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant drip of water and the soft rustle of the faceless cloak against stone. "Ah," they said finally. "Yes. A humming. Like a lullaby, but wrong somehow." Elara nodded, withdrawing her hand. "The monolith sings to those who know how to listen. It's grown louder since I left." They continued deeper, following the ethereal song that vibrated through Elara's very marrow. The tunnels narrowed, then widened again into a vast chamber supported by columns carved to resemble writhing, elongated human forms. Their faces were contorted in expressions that might have been ecstasy or agony. It was impossible to tell. "The supplicant's hall," the faceless whispered. "Few living eyes have seen this place. Fewer still have survived the seeing," Elara replied, moving to the center of the chamber, where a circular drain gaped like an open mouth. "This is one of the throat points, places where the barrier between our world and what lies beneath is thinnest." She knelt, removing a small knife from her boot. With a swift motion, she pricked her finger and allowed 3 drops of blood to fall into the drain. The crimson droplets seemed to hover in the air for a heartbeat before being drawn downward, as if pulled by an unseen force. A low, rumbling groan emanated from the depths, and the ground trembled slightly. "What are you doing?" the faceless asked, an edge of alarm in their normally modulated voice. "Paying the toll," Elara said as she stood. "We're about to have company." No sooner had she spoken than a figure emerged from a tunnel on the far side of the chamber. A figure that at first glance appeared to be a child of perhaps 8 years, with golden curls and a simple white shift. But its movements were wrong, jerky and too fluid by turns, and its eyes, when it lifted its head, were solid black from lid to lid. "Hello, little one," Elara said softly. "I've come with a question for your mistress." The child thing's head tilted at an impossible angle. When it spoke, its voice was a discordant chorus of whispers. "The Nightshade returns to the Garden of Bones. The mistress has been expecting you." It turned and began to walk back the way it had come, its bare feet leaving wet, red footprints on the stone. Elara followed, gesturing for the faceless to stay close. "Don't look directly at it," she warned. "And whatever you do, don't touch it." They traversed a series of increasingly narrow passages, the walls closing in until they were forced to proceed single file, shoulders brushing against the damp stone on either side. The humming grew louder, resolving itself into a melody that made the faceless teeth ache and vision blur. Finally, they emerged into another chamber, smaller than the supplicant's hall, but more ornate. The walls were lined with niches, each containing a preserved human head. Hundreds of them, their eyes replaced with gemstones that caught and reflected the light of the floating orbs that illuminated the space. At the center of the room sat a woman on a throne of fused human bones. She might once have been beautiful, but her features had been altered, not by age, but by something more profound. Her skin was the pale blue-white of a drowned corpse, and patterns like frost flowers bloomed across her exposed flesh. Her hair, a cascade of white shot through with streaks of midnight blue, floated around her head as if she were underwater. "Elara Nightshade," she said, her voice surprisingly warm and rich. "The prodigal daughter returns." Elara bowed, not out of respect but pragmatism. "Lady Frostmere, you look, well." A laugh like breaking icicles. "Liar. I look exactly as I should, transformed by my communion with what dwells beyond." Her gaze shifted to the faceless. "And you've brought a spy. How thoughtful." "An ally," Elara corrected. "We seek information about the Codex Umbra." Lady Frostmere's expression sharpened. "A dangerous book. It found its way to Old Thorne, and now he's gone. What makes you think you'd fare any better?" "Because unlike Thorne, I've already glimpsed what waits beyond the veil. I've felt its touch and survived." Elara stepped closer to the throne, into the pool of ghostly light that surrounded it. "The 5th moon wanes soon. The stars align. Something comes, something that knows my name. Not just yours." Lady Frostmere rose from her throne, her movements liquid and unsettling. She glided forward, stopping just short of Elara. "All the marked ones are being called. The question is, by what, and for what purpose?" "That's what I intend to discover. But I need the Codex." Lady Frostmere studied her for a long moment, then raised a hand to caress Elara's cheek. Her touch was cold enough to burn. The codex is no longer in Ravenscroft. The cult took it to their sanctuary in the blighted mire. But her fingers moved to the silver streak in Elara's hair, twisting it gently. You don't need the book to find your answers. The one you seek is much closer. Damienblackwood, Elara said, a complicated emotion tightening her throat. Yes, the man whose brother you murdered. Lady Frostmere's lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. He's changed, little Nightshade. The mark has grown in him, flourished in ways yours has not. He walks in two worlds now. The faceless shifted uneasily. We should go. The ritual at the Hollow will begin soon. Lady Frostmere's gaze snapped to them, suddenly cold. Yes, the ritual. 5 marked ones, 5 sacrifices, 5 moons in alignment. A door will open, but what comes through may not be what Blackwood expects. What do you mean? Elara asked. Instead of answering, Lady Frostmere returned to her throne. The child thing that had led them appeared at her side, nestling against her like a pet seeking affection. The toll for this information is higher than the blood you've already paid, she said. I require a promise. Elara tensed. Promises to beings like Lady Frostmere were binding in ways that transcended mere words. What promise? When you stand before the open door, remember this. What passes through goes both ways. A sacrifice freely given holds more power than one taken by force. Lady Frostmere's eyes seemed to look through Elara, beyond her. Promise me that when the moment comes, you will remember my words. After a moment's hesitation, Elara nodded. I promise. Good. Lady Frostmere's attention shifted to the faceless. And from you, little spy, I require a smaller token. Leave your mask. The faceless stiffened. My mask is my identity. Precisely. Lady Frostmere's smile widened, revealing teeth filed to points. A fair trade for your life, wouldn't you say? A tense silence fell. Then slowly, the faceless reached up and removed the porcelain mask, revealing the same ordinary, forgettable features Elara had glimpsed at the inn. Take it, they said, voice tight with suppressed emotion as they placed the mask on the ground before the throne. The child thing darted forward, snatching up the mask and retreating to Lady Frostmere's side, where it placed the porcelain face over its own. The effect was disturbing, a child's body with the expressionless visage of a weeping adult. Now go, Lady Frostmere commanded. Blackwood waits at the Hollow. The 5th hour approaches, and with it, the thinning of the veil. As they turned to leave, she called after them. One last thing, Nightshade. When you see what has become of Damien's face beneath his mask, remember that some scars are gifts. They let the outside in, and the inside out. They retraced their steps through the labyrinth of tunnels, the faceless now barefaced and visibly uncomfortable. Without the mask, they seemed diminished somehow, less certain. What did she mean about Damien's face? They asked as they neared the surface. Elara's expression darkened. The night I killed Gerard, something happened. The thing inhabiting him fought back, and in the struggle, Damien was injured. Badly. I thought he had died. But he didn't. No. And now I wonder if what saved him was the same thing that took his brother. She paused as they reached a ladder leading up to a street grate. You don't have to come with me to the Hollow. Your debt to Thorne is paid. The faceless, or rather, the person who had been the faceless, shook their head. My involvement goes beyond Thorne now. I've seen too much to turn back. A rueful smile. Besides, without my mask, I need a new purpose. Might as well be saving the world from eldritch horrors. Elara studied them for a moment, then nodded. What should I call you now? A moment's consideration. Mira. My name is Mira. Very well, Mira. Elara began to climb. Let's go meet our destiny. And Damienblackwood. Above them, the 5 moons had aligned in a pattern not seen in centuries, casting overlapping shadows that seemed to move with a will of their own. The 3rd hour had begun, and with it, the final countdown to whatever waited beyond the veil. Chapter 4. The Hollow. The Hollow was alive with movement when Elara and Mira arrived. Robed figures circled the 5 ceremonial fires, their chanting rising and falling in hypnotic patterns. At the center, the monolith pulsed with an inner light that seeped through the ancient carvings, making them appear to writhe and shift. They approached cautiously, staying to the shadows of the encircling trees. Withered, twisted things that bore no leaves regardless of season. From their vantage point, Elara could see the 5 altars arranged in a pentagram around the monolith, each bearing a shrouded form. The sacrifices, she murmured. Mira squinted, their ordinary features creased with concern. They're still alive. I can see the shrouds moving with their breathing. Before Elara could respond, a raven swooped down, landing on a branch just above their heads. It was unnaturally large, its feathers gleaming with an oily iridescence in the moonlight. It fixed them with intelligent eyes and cawed once, a sound too deep and resonant for any natural bird. "We've been found," Elara said, straightening. "No point in hiding now." As if in response, the raven took flight again, circling once before gliding toward a figure that stood apart from the ritual, observing from a raised platform cut into the rock face. Even at a distance, Elara recognized the tall, imposing silhouette and the bone half-mask that gleamed pale against the darkness. Damienblackwood. The raven alighted on his outstretched arm, and he turned his gaze directly to where Elara and Mira stood among the trees. Even across the distance, she felt the weight of his attention like a physical touch. "Come," said a voice behind them, and they turned to find Cordelia Frost standing there, her white blonde hair luminous in the darkness. "He's waiting." Elara tensed, her hand instinctively moving to the dagger at her hip. "Cordelia, still serving as Blackwood's faithful hound, I see." A flicker of annoyance crossed Cordelia's otherwise impassive features. "And you're still quick to judge what you don't understand, Nightshade." Her pale eyes shifted to Mira. "The faceless, without their face. How interesting." "My name is Mira now," they replied stiffly. "Is it?" Cordelia's tone suggested she found this amusing. "Names have power here. Choose yours carefully." She gestured for them to follow. "This way, and keep your weapons sheathed. The acolytes are on edge tonight." They followed her down a path that wound through the trees and along the edge of the hollow. As they walked, Elara studied the woman who had once been her rival for Damien's affections. Like Damien, Cordelia had changed in the decade since Elara had left Ravenscroft. There was a new hardness to her, a cold precision to her movements that spoke of discipline and purpose. "What's your stake in all this, Cordelia?" Elara asked. "You were never one for rituals and ancient mysteries." "People change," Cordelia replied without looking back. "Some of us stayed to face the consequences of that night, rather than running." Elara's jaw tightened, but she held her retort. There would be time for old grudges later, if they survived what was to come. They ascended a narrow staircase cut into the rock, emerging onto the platform where Damien waited. The raven was gone, but in its place stood two robed acolytes, their faces hidden beneath hoods. And then there was Damien himself. He had always been tall, but the years had added a breadth to his shoulders and a solidity to his presence that made him seem even more imposing. His black hair, once short, now fell to his shoulders, framing the unmarred side of his face. The bone half-mask covered the left side, from forehead to jaw, its surface etched with intricate patterns that matched those on the monolith below. "Elara," he said, and his voice, deeper than she remembered, but with the same melodic quality, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. "You came." "Not by choice," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "Your letter was persuasive." A slight inclination of his head. Thorne's letter, though delivered at my request. His visible eye, that familiar copper hue, studied her intently. "You haven't changed." "Neither have you," she lied. A smile touched the corner of his mouth, the only part of his lips visible beneath the mask. "We both know that's not true." He gestured to the acolytes. "Leave us." They bowed and retreated, as did Cordelia, though she cast a warning glance at Elara before descending the stairs. When they were alone, save for Mira, who stood awkwardly to one side, Damien moved closer. Elara held her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to maintain distance. "Why am I here, Damien? What do you want from me?" "The same thing you want," he replied. "Answers." He turned, gazing down at the ritual below. "The veil is thinning, Elara. What waits beyond has been patient for centuries, but that patience wanes with the fifth moon. It calls to us, to the marked ones." "Us?" she asked. "You're marked now too?" In answer, he reached up and slowly removed the bone mask. Elara couldn't stop the small gasp that escaped her lips. The left side of his face was transformed. What had once been ruined flesh, scarred by the dark energy that had erupted when she killed Gerard, had become something else entirely. His skin there was now a deep, iridescent blue-black, like the feathers of the raven. The pattern shifted subtly as she watched, seeming to flow beneath the surface. His left eye, once copper like the right, was now entirely black, with pinpricks of light within that mimicked stars. "The night you killed what was left of my brother, something touched me," Damien said quietly. "It should have killed me. Instead, it changed me." He replaced the mask, securing it with practiced movements. As it changed you, though in different ways. Elara unconsciously touched the silver streak in her hair. What is it? What's happening to us? That's what the ritual will reveal. He gestured to the 5 altars below. 5 sacrifices, 5 marked ones, 5 moons in alignment. When the veil thins at the 5th hour, we'll channel the energy through the monolith and open a controlled doorway to what lies beyond. And then what? We ask our questions, and we receive our answers. Damien turned to Mira, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. You were Thorne's agent. Did he tell you what he discovered before he died? Mira shook their head. Only that something was coming, and that the marked ones were the key. Not just the key, Damien corrected. With a lock as well. The door cannot open without us, nor can it close. He returned his attention to Elara. There are 3 others waiting below. Like us, they bear marks, though each manifests differently. And the sacrifices? Elara asked, her voice hardening. Are they willing? 3 came voluntarily. They understand the honor of serving as conduits. The other 2? A pause. The other 2 were necessary. Necessary? Elara's eyes flashed with anger. You speak of murder as if it's a clerical detail. It's not murder, Elara. It's transformation. Damien's masked face was unreadable. What passes through the veil is changed, but not ended. Those who serve as sacrifices will become something new. Like Gerard? Like the thing that wore his skin? She stepped closer, close enough to see the subtle movement beneath the exposed portion of his face. That's not transformation, Damien. It's possession. Corruption. You don't understand because you've been running for 10 years instead of seeking answers. There was an edge to his voice now. What happened to Gerard was uncontrolled, chaotic. This ritual is precise, designed over centuries of study. Mira cleared their throat. The hour approaches. If we're to participate, we should join the others. Damien nodded, the tension between him and Elara momentarily set aside. Yes. Call me. It's time you met the other marked ones. They descended the stairs and made their way along the edge of the hollow toward a small structure built into the rock face. More cave than building, its entrance framed by stone pillars carved with the same symbols that adorned the monolith. Inside, 3 figures waited in a chamber lit by the same phosphorescent fungi Elara had seen in the sewers beneath Ravenscroft. They turned as Damien entered, followed by Elara and Mira. My friends, Damien said, his voice carrying a subtle authority that seemed to fill the space. The 5th has arrived. Elara Nightshade, I present your fellow marked ones. The first was a woman of indeterminate age, her skin deeply tanned and weathered as if she had spent decades under harsh suns. She wore simple traveling clothes, but around her neck hung dozens of small vials containing what appeared to be soil samples of different colors. Her eyes were her most striking feature, entirely amber, with vertical pupils like those of a cat. Tolly a Sandspeaker, she said by way of introduction, her voice carrying the faint trace of an accent Elara couldn't place. I walk the waste and hear the whispers of the dead earth. The second was a young man, perhaps no more than 20, with a scholarly appearance accentuated by wire-rimmed spectacles. He might have seemed entirely ordinary were it not for his hands, both of which appeared to be made of articulated crystal that clicked softly as he moved his fingers. The crystal caught the light, refracting it into tiny rainbows that danced across the walls. Eli Glasshands, he said with a slight bow. Archivist and reluctant participant in tonight's festivities. The third figure stood apart from the others, cloaked and hooded in a way that concealed most of their features. What was visible of their face seemed to shift and blur, as if viewed through rippling water. Maven, they said simply, voice neither male nor female, but somehow both. No other name is needed. Elara inclined her head to each in turn. I'm not sure what Damien has told you about me, but that you killed his brother, fled Ravenscroft, and have spent a decade trying to undo your mark rather than understand it, Maven interrupted, their fluid features impossible to read. Also that without you, the ritual cannot proceed. Your participation is non-negotiable. Elara's eyes narrowed. Is that so? It is, Damien confirmed, moving to the center of the chamber where a table had been set up, its surface covered with maps, diagrams, and a model of the hollow carved from what appeared to be bone. The ritual requires 5. Each of us represents an element of the veil, a cornerstone, if you will. And what element am I supposed to represent? Elara asked. Tolly a Sandspeaker answered, her cat-like eyes gleaming. Life and death. The threshold between existence and non-existence. Because I killed Gerard? Because you've killed many times since then, Eli Glasshands said matter-of-factly, his crystal fingers tapping against his arm with a sound like wind chimes. We all have our roles to play. Talia represents earth and transformation. I represent knowledge and perception. Maven embodies transition and fluidity. And Damien? Elara asked, looking to the masked man. Power, Maven said. Raw, unfiltered power. The conduit through which the energy will flow. Damien spread his hands on the table, studying the model of the hollow. The ritual is straightforward. Each of us will stand at one point of the pentagram. When the 5th hour strikes, the sacrifices will be offered, and we will channel the released energy through our marks. The monolith will serve as the focal point, creating an opening in the veil. And then? Mira asked, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the chamber. And then we receive the emissary, Damien replied. A representative of what dwells beyond the veil. Elara felt a chill run through her as she recalled Lady Frostmere's warning. What passes through goes both ways. Damien's head tilted. What did you say? A sacrifice freely given holds more power than one taken by force, she continued, the words coming unbidden to her lips. Lady Frostmere made me promise to remember that when the moment came. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. Talia Sandspeaker fingered one of the vials at her neck, her expression troubled. Eli Glasshand's crystal fingers clinked more rapidly, betraying agitation. You went to the Frost Witch? Damien asked, his voice carefully controlled. When? Before coming here. Elara met his gaze evenly. I needed information about the Codex Umbra. The Codex is a means to an end, Damien dismissed. The ritual will give us direct access to the source of all the knowledge the book contains and more. Unless something goes wrong, Eli interjected, adjusting his spectacles nervously. I've been studying the astronomical alignments. The 5th moon's position is unpredictable. There's a margin for error we haven't accounted for. All the more reason to proceed as planned, Maven said. If the alignment is shifting, we must act now or wait another century. A tense silence fell over the group, broken only by the distant chanting from the hollow outside. Elara studied each of her fellow marked ones, weighing their words against the warning Lady Frostmere had given her. If I participate, she said finally, I want assurances that no one else will be harmed unnecessarily. The willing sacrifices may proceed, but the unwilling must be released. Damien's visible eye narrowed. You're not in a position to make demands, Elara. Aren't I? You said yourself the ritual cannot proceed without 5 marked ones. I am the 5th. She crossed her arms. Release the unwilling sacrifices, or find yourself another death-marked participant. For a moment, it seemed Damien might refuse. Then, to everyone's surprise, he nodded. Very well. The unwilling will be released and replaced with proxies, symbolic representations rather than living vessels. It will weaken the ritual, but not prevent it. Relief washed through Elara, though she kept her expression neutral. Then I will participate. Good. Damien straightened. Prepare yourselves. We begin at the 4th hour. He gestured to a row of alcoves cut into the chamber wall, each containing a basin of water and various ritual implements. Purify your marks. Open yourselves to what comes. As the group dispersed to the alcoves, Mira approached Elara. I don't like this, they said quietly. There's too much we don't know. Which is precisely why we must proceed, Elara replied, keeping her voice low. Whatever comes through the veil, I need to face it. I need to understand what happened that night with Gerard, what's happening to all of us now. Mira seemed unconvinced, but nodded reluctantly. I'll remain at the edge of the ritual space. If anything goes wrong. If anything goes wrong, run, Elara said firmly. Get word to Lady Frostmere. She'll know what to do. As Mira slipped away, Damien approached, having overheard the exchange. The spy has grown attached to you quickly, he observed. They're not a spy anymore, thanks to your ritual preparations. Elara moved to one of the alcoves, pouring water from a silver pitcher into the basin. You've changed, Damien. There was a time when you wouldn't have countenanced unwilling sacrifices. He watched as she began to wash her hands in the basin, the water turning slightly silver where it touched the mark on her wrist. We've all changed. The world has changed around us. What's coming will change it even more. Elara paused, looking up at him. What if we can't control what comes through? We can. We must. He hesitated, then added more softly. I've spent 10 years preparing for this moment, Elara. Planning every detail, accounting for every variable. Except me, she said. You didn't expect me to return. A shadow passed across his visible eye. No. I hoped, but I didn't expect. He reached out, almost touching the silver streak in her hair, before letting his hand fall away. "There's something I need to show you before the ritual begins. Something only you can see." Intrigued despite her reservations, Elara followed as Damien led her deeper into the cave complex, away from the others. They passed through a narrow corridor that opened into a small, private chamber. Unlike the rest of the cave, this space appeared lived in. A desk covered in papers, bookshelves carved directly into the rock walls, a simple cot in one corner. "Your sanctuary?" she asked. "My prison at times." Damien moved to a cabinet and unlocked it with a key he wore around his neck. From within, he withdrew a cloth-wrapped object about the size of a large book. "I lied earlier. The Codex Umbra is not merely a means to an end. It's the key to understanding what we are." He unwrapped the cloth, revealing not a book but a stone tablet, its surface covered in the same script that adorned the monolith. Unlike the monolith's carvings, however, these seemed to move perceptibly, forming and reforming into different configurations as they watched. "Is that a fragment of the original codex?" "Yes. The book itself is a translation, an interpretation. This is the source." Damien placed it on the desk. "I've spent years trying to decipher it. The language changes depending on who reads it, and when, and why." Elara approached cautiously, drawn to the shifting script despite her misgivings. "What does it say to you?" "Fragments. Pieces." Damien's voice had taken on a distant quality. "It speaks of the marked ones as vessels, conduits between worlds. It says the veil was created not to protect us from what lies beyond, but to protect what lies beyond from us." Elara frowned. "That can't be right. The histories all say the veil appeared after the calamity, to shield the surviving settlements from the chaos that had consumed the rest of the world. History is written by survivors, not witnesses." Damien gestured to the tablet. "Touch it. See what it reveals to you." Hesitantly, Elara reached out, her fingers hovering over the stone. The moment she made contact, the script flared with silver light that matched the streak in her hair. Images flooded her mind, too fast to process fully, but carrying impressions of vast, impossible geometries, beings of light and darkness intertwined, and a sense of ancient, patient intelligence. One image lingered longer than the others. 5 figures standing in a circle, hand in hand, their features obscured but their stances familiar. Around them, a landscape of twisted, broken reality, and beyond, a door opening onto perfect, terrible void. She jerked her hand away, gasping. "The ritual, it's been performed before." Damien nodded grimly. "Many times, across many centuries. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not." He rewrapped the tablet, but never with the same 5 marks aligned at the same time. "That's what makes tonight different. That's why it must be now." A bell tolled in the distance, a deep, resonant note that seemed to vibrate through the stone around them. "The 4th hour begins," Damien said, securing the tablet in the cabinet once more. "It's time." As they made their way back to the main chamber, Elara's mind raced with the implications of what she'd seen. The warning from Lady Frostmere took on new urgency. Something about the ritual wasn't as Damien believed. Something crucial had been misinterpreted or deliberately obscured. The other marked ones were waiting, each having completed their purification. Talia Sandspeaker's amber eyes seemed to glow in the dim light, while Eli Glasshand's crystal fingers refracted the ambient illumination into complex patterns on the walls. Maven's features had settled somewhat, though their face still rippled occasionally, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a breeze. "It's time," Damien announced. "Remember your positions and your purpose. Whatever comes through the veil, we face it together." As they filed out of the cave and toward the hollow, Elara caught sight of Mira standing at the edge of the ritual space, their ordinary face a mask of concern. Cordelia Frost was there as well, directing the acolytes who now led just 3 shrouded figures to the altars. The other 2 altars had been prepared with bundles of herbs, bones, and crystalline formations, the symbolic proxies Damien had promised. The 5 moons hung overhead, their combined light casting the hollow in an ethereal glow. The monolith at the center pulsed with inner radiance, the carvings on its surface more active than ever, writhing and flowing like living things. Elara took her position at one point of the pentagram, directly across from Damien. To her right stood Talia, to her left Eli. Maven completed the formation, standing between Eli and Damien. The chanting of the acolytes reached a crescendo, then stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound that Elara could hear the blood rushing in her ears. Damien raised his hands, and when he spoke, his voice carried effortlessly across the hollow. "We stand at the threshold between worlds, between realities. We, the marked ones, call to what waits beyond the veil. We offer energy, passage, communion. We seek knowledge, understanding, truth. The other marked ones raised their hands as well, and Elara followed suit. She felt a tingling in her mark, a response to the energy building in the circle. By earth, by knowledge, by transition, by power, by death, Damien intoned. We open the way. At his signal, acolytes approached each altar. 3 drew ceremonial daggers, positioning them above the hearts of the willing sacrifices. The other 2 lit bundles of herbs atop the proxy altars, sending fragrant smoke spiraling upward. Elara tensed, her gaze fixed on the monolith. The stone was vibrating now, the entire structure humming with power. The air around it seemed to waver, like heat rising from sun-baked stone. The bell tolled again, marking the half-hour. The acolytes plunged their daggers downward, and the willing sacrifices arched in unison, their final breaths escaping in clouds of vapor that were unnaturally dense and white. At the same moment, the herbs on the proxy altars erupted into flames far larger than they should have produced. Energy surged through the pentagram. Elara felt it like a physical blow, making her stagger. The mark on her wrist burned, the silver streak in her hair glowing with inner light. Around her, the other marked ones experienced similar reactions. Talia's amber eyes blazed like twin suns. Eli's crystal hands shattered and reformed repeatedly in rapid succession. Maven's form lost all definition, becoming a swirling column of mist and shadow. And Damien's mask cracked down the middle, falling away to reveal his transformed face in its entirety. The iridescent blue-black had spread further, covering more than half his features now. His darkened eye had become a window onto something vast and incomprehensible, stars wheeling in endless void. The monolith split from top to bottom with a sound like the world breaking. From within the crack, a light emerged, not the warm light of sun or fire, but a cold, piercing illumination that hurt to look upon directly. It expanded outward, forming a doorway of perfect radiance, and something began to come through. At first, it was just a suggestion of form, a ripple in the light, a darkening at its center. Then it took shape, or shapes, plural and singular at once. It was tall, towering over even the monolith, but it was also small, condensed, as if its true mass existed in dimensions they couldn't perceive. It had many limbs, or perhaps wings, or perhaps they were neither. Its head, if it could be called that, was a corona of shifting geometry that hurt Elara's mind to track. "The emissary comes," Damien called, his voice altered, deeper and somehow layered with other voices speaking just out of sync. "Ask your questions now." But Elara's attention had fixed on something else, a detail that filled her with horror. At the base of the entity, where it connected to the light of the doorway, she saw faces, human faces contorted in silent screams. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, all being gradually absorbed into the greater mass of the being. And one of them, clearer than the others, was Gerard Blackwood. "Damien!" she screamed over the rising wind that now whipped around the hollow. "It's not an emissary. It's a collector." Her words were lost as the entity fully emerged, its presence bending reality around it. The air crackled with energy, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. The 3 acolytes who had performed the sacrifices fell to their knees, blood streaming from their eyes, noses, and ears. Talia Sandspeaker was the first to break formation, staggering backward, her hands clutching at the vials around her neck. "This is wrong," she gasped. "This is not what was promised." Eli Glasshands followed, his crystal hands shattering completely this time, leaving him with stumps that bled not blood, but liquid light. "The alignment," he cried. "It's wrong. The 5th moon has shifted." Only Maven held their position, their form now completely amorphous, a swirling cloud of possibility with no fixed shape. "Fascinating," came their voice from everywhere and nowhere. "A true breach, a total communion." And Damien stood transfixed, his arms still raised, his transformed face alight with rapture. "Yes," he whispered, though somehow Elara heard him clearly despite the chaos. Show me everything." The entity reached for him with appendages that were neither tentacles nor hands, extensions of its being that left trails of light in the air. As they neared Damien, Elara saw his body begin to change, the transformation of his face accelerating, spreading across his entire form. Lady Frostmere's warning echoed in her mind. A sacrifice freely given holds more power than one taken by force. Understanding crashed through her like lightning. The ritual wasn't meant to open a controlled doorway. It was a feeding. The entity fed on the willing, on those who opened themselves to it. That was why it had taken Gerard, why it now reached for Damien. They had invited it in. "Damien, no!" she cried, breaking formation and running toward him. "It's consuming you." His head turned toward her, and for a moment, she saw clarity return to his eyes. One copper, one void black. Recognition, fear, and beneath it all, a terrible understanding. "Elara," he said, his voice his own again though strained. "It's been inside me for 10 years. It brought me back that night. It showed me how to find the others. How to prepare the ritual." His expression twisted with anguish. "I thought I was using it, but it was using me. Using us all." The entity's appendages were wrapping around him now, lifting him from the ground. Where they touched, his flesh transmuted, becoming the same iridescent blue-black as his marked face. "What do we do?" Mira shouted from the edge of the hollow, having to brace themselves against the intensifying wind. Elara looked from Damien to the entity to the broken monolith, her mind racing. The doorway remained open, a perfect tear in reality. What passes through goes both ways. "The door," she said, realization dawning. "It's not just a way in, it's a way out." She turned to the remaining marked ones. "Talia, Eli, we need to reverse the flow." "How?" Eli cried, holding up his shattered hands. "The pentagram," Elara shouted. "We need to complete it again, but in reverse. Counterclockwise." Understanding dawned on Talia's face. She nodded and moved to take up position at a different point than before. Eli hesitated, then followed suit. "Maven," Elara called to the swirling mist form. "We need you." For a moment, it seemed Maven wouldn't respond. Then the mist condensed somewhat, forming a vaguely humanoid shape that drifted to the appropriate position. Elara took her place, completing the reversed pentagram. "Focus on your marks. Feel the flow of energy and push it back toward the doorway." She concentrated on her own mark, feeling the silver fire that ran through her hair and down to her wrist. Instead of channeling it outward as before, she directed it inward, then toward the entity and the doorway. Damien was almost completely transformed now, his body a construct of living darkness, shot through with points of light like stars. The entity had nearly absorbed him, but he was still conscious, still himself enough to lock eyes with Elara one final time. "Finish it," he mouthed. "Send it back." Tears streamed down Elara's face as she nodded. "I'm sorry," she whispered. With every ounce of her will, she forced her power toward the doorway, feeling the other marked ones doing the same. The energy that had flowed outward now reversed, creating a vortex that pulled toward the light rather than away from it. The entity sensed the change. It twisted, its impossible geometry becoming even more convoluted as it tried to maintain its hold on reality. The faces at its base, including Gerard's, contorted in silent screams. Damien, now almost entirely one with the entity, raised what had once been his arms. "Gerard," he said, his voice barely recognizable. "I'm coming." With what seemed to be the last of his human will, he pushed against the entity from within, adding his strength to the vortex, pulling them back through the doorway. The entity shrieked, a sound beyond sound that shattered the remaining glass in Eli's spectacles and caused several of Talia's vials to explode. It thrashed, its numerous appendages lashing out, catching one of the fleeing acolytes and reducing them to dust in an instant. But the pull was too strong. Inch by inch, it was drawn back toward the doorway. It fought, clawing at reality itself, leaving tears in the air that leaked darkness and light simultaneously. "Hold," Elara commanded, her voice raw with effort. "Just a little more." The entity, with Damien now fully incorporated into its mass, reached the threshold of the doorway. With a final, reality-bending scream, it was sucked through, disappearing into the perfect light. For a moment, the doorway remained, pulsing with energy. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, it collapsed in on itself. The broken halves of the monolith slammed back together, the cracked ceiling as if it had never been. A shockwave of displaced air knocked everyone to the ground. When Elara managed to look up again, the hollow was still, the ceremonial fires extinguished, the altars empty save for ash. Silence fell, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. Mira approached cautiously, helping Elara to her feet. "Is it over?" they asked. Elara stared at the monolith, now inert, the carvings on its surface still once more. "For now," she said quietly. "But the veil is weakened. There will be other breaches, other entities seeking entry." Talia Sandspeaker joined them, her amber eyes dimmed with exhaustion. "What was it? Truly?" "A harvester," Elara said. "It feeds on willing sacrifices, on those who open themselves to it. It's been influencing events for centuries, perhaps longer, manipulating situations to create opportunities for feeding. And Damien? Mira asked gently. Elara looked to where he had stood. Nothing remained. No body, no trace that he had ever existed. He knew at the end. He helped us close the door. Eli Glasshands approached, his hands beginning to regenerate, crystals slowly reforming from the stumps. The Codex Umbra warned of this. That's why Thorne was killed. He discovered the truth and tried to stop the ritual. And Maven? Talia asked, looking around. But the fluid-formed marked one was nowhere to be seen. They had vanished as completely as the entity itself. Gone back to wherever they came from, Elara surmised. I don't think Maven was ever fully human. Perhaps a fragment of something beyond the veil that had taken human form. A scout for what followed. Cordelia Frost appeared, disheveled but alive. Her pale eyes took in the scene, lingering on the space where Damien had been. For a moment, her composed facade cracked, revealing genuine grief. He believed he was saving the world, she said softly. He believed the entity would share knowledge, power, the secrets of the universe. She looked to Elara. He never stopped loving you, you know. Even after everything. Elara couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She simply nodded. Dawn was breaking. The first true dawn Ravenscroft had seen in 7 generations. The mist that had perpetually shrouded the city was thinning, allowing weak sunlight to filter through. The 5 moons were fading from the sky, returning to their normal phases and positions. The veil, Talia gasped, pointing to the horizon. It's lifting. Indeed, the oppressive twilight that had been the norm for centuries was receding, like a tide pulling back from shore. Colors seemed brighter, the air clearer. Not lifting, Elara corrected, understanding flowing through her. Healing. When we reversed the flow, we didn't just force the entity back. We began to repair the damage it had done over the centuries. What now? Mira asked, squinting in the unaccustomed sunlight. Elara looked down at her wrist. The mark was still there, but it had changed. The intricate patterns were simpler now, less chaotic. The silver streak in her hair remained, a permanent reminder of what she had experienced, what she had lost. Now we prepare, she said. The entity is gone, but there will be others. The veil is thinner than it was before. We need to find the remaining marked ones, teach them what we've learned. She looked at each of them in turn. We need to be ready for the next breach. Talia nodded resolutely. I'll return to the waste. There are whispers of another marked one there, a child born with eyes like mine. I'll search the archives, Eli offered. There must be other copies of the Codex, other fragments of knowledge that can help us understand what we're facing. Mira stepped forward. And I'll come with you, Elara, if you'll have me. The Faceless had many contacts, many resources that could be useful. Elara considered them all. These unlikely allies brought together by circumstance and cosmic forces beyond their understanding. Then she looked back at the hollow, at the place where Damien had stood in his final moments of humanity. She owed it to him, to Gerard, to all those who had been taken, to continue the fight. We leave at midday, she said. There's a marked one in the blighted mire, who doesn't yet know what they are. We'll start there. As the sun climbed higher in a sky that Ravenscroft hadn't seen in 3 centuries, Elara felt something she hadn't experienced in a decade. Hope. Not the naive hope of youth, but the tempered, resilient hope that comes with understanding one's purpose. The veil had thinned, but it had not broken. And as long as she drew breath, Elara Nightshade would ensure it never did. Epilogue. The chamber beneath the Cathedral of the Forgotten Saint was silent save for the soft scratching of a quill on parchment. Maven, or the being that had called itself Maven, sat at a simple desk, recording the events of the night in precise, flowing script. The experiment yielded unexpected results. Subject Blackwood's assimilation was successful, but ultimately compromised by emotional attachment to subject Nightshade. The reversed energy flow caused significant damage to the collection apparatus. Estimated recovery time: 1 century, for years, 17 days. The other marked ones showed remarkable adaptability. Subject Sandspeaker's connection to physical elements provides an interesting counterbalance to Subject Glasshand's affinity for abstract constructs. Subject Nightshade remains the most promising candidate for future integration, though her resistance is substantial. The Veil has begun self-repair procedures. This was unforeseen, but not insurmountable. Future breaches will require more subtle manipulation over extended periods. Maven set down the quill and raised a hand, watching as the fingers elongated, became fluid, then returned to human proportions. The disguise was holding well, despite the energy expenditure of the night. Recommendation: continue observation. Maintain distance from subjects. Establish new collection points at the remaining thin spaces. Prepare secondary harvest ritual for the alignment in approximately 53 years. The being that was not Maven walked to a mirror mounted on the stone wall. In its reflection, instead of a blur of features, it saw its true form, a swirling vortex of light and darkness, of mathematics and impossibility. It allowed itself a moment of its natural state before reasserting the human guise. There was time. There was always time. The entities beyond the veil existed in dimensions where time was merely another malleable construct. And Elara Nightshade, for all her perception and power, had missed the most important truth of all. The entity they had forced back through the doorway was merely a fragment, a collecting appendage of something far larger and more patient. The real harvest had yet to begin. Maven, or rather, the thing wearing Maven's form, smiled at its reflection. The smile began human but widened, stretching beyond the physical limitations of a human face, until it split the head entirely, revealing the void within. In the shadows of its mind, the collected consciousness of Damienblackwood screamed silently, one voice among thousands, as the being began to plan the next opening of the veil. The end.